Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to my talk. The last talk today, I promise it won't be very dense. I'm going to use a model like you saw in the previous talk, but I'm going to try and make it very interactive and relatable. I named this talk about the boundary of acceptable performance. It'll come clear is that how we can use models. In this case, I'm going to use a model that was published about 27 years ago, well before even the company I worked for existed, and how it actually relates a lot to what companies do, especially in a very modern context as well, what a lot of us have been dealing with, but how it actually relates very much to operational work. So if you want to connect with me, that's my handle down the bottom. You can get that on LinkedIn and other places. I would love feedback, good, bad, otherwise. I take it all in, so thank you. Okay, so to start with, what I want to do out of this talk is, one, help broaden perspective. What are the internal and external forces that act on you, that act on your teams, that act on your companies, that act on your organizations? And how you can, with a greater understanding of these contexts, you'll get more value when things don't go as planned. And ideally, you'll ask better questions, not just of your teams, but the organizations themselves. That you will have a better understanding or context around where margins for error exist, and how to reinforce them, and why you should reinforce them, and the tactics you can apply in order to hopefully be able to proactively implement these. And lastly, I just cheekily wanted to say that, models are approximations, but they're useful. If you're wondering who that fellow is, it's George Box. He's famous for quoting, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So take it as read. So the person who oh golly, let me just refresh that because, there we go. So as Marianne's previous talk, I'm using a model created by Jens Rasmussen, a Danish human factors and safety science expert. The model is boundary of acceptable performance, economic and workload, and he published it in this paper back in 1997. Now, Rasmussen, when he created this model, this is based on decades of research across major industries. Could be healthcare, could be shipping, could be power. And when he was using all this research, he was forming it in the context of socio-technical systems, which he defines using the paper as being both hierarchical and multidisciplinary, and I'll explain a little bit about what he means there, and also in the context of systems thinking. The key point to note about this model is he defines it, the fish diagram, I think I haven't heard it called a fish before, is there's these three distinct boundaries at the edge. The circle in the middle, where it talks about Brownian movements, if you're wondering what on earth a Brownian movement is, it's the random movement of particles in a medium. What it's really saying is that your operating point, your company, even a society, even an industry, is never static. It's always moving within these boundaries, and unfortunately, it's always usually moving to the boundary of performance, which for us in operations roles, that's where we work. I won't explain anything about systems thinking. Hopefully some of you have read this book or are aware of it. If you haven't, I highly recommend you read it. You could read it in a weekend. It'll change your worldview. Socio-technical systems, I could probably talk for hours on them, but I'll just leave you with that very simple explanation. And define it simply as, you're not looking at people and systems as separate entities. You are actually looking at them together and the interactions between them. So you're not trying to see, I'm just going to see this purely as a people problem or purely as a systems problem. You're looking at it more as, no, I'm looking at the interactions between them, because everything we do is really complex. And the only way to truly understand complexity is to look at the interactions between these nodes both between people and systems, and not them separately. In Rasmussen's paper, he defines socio-technical systems following this structural hierarchy. This is an example he uses, but the point he makes is that in order to understand each of these layers requires different research disciplines. You can't come at trying to understand a very complex socio-technical system with just one, field or background. As an example, I have a computer science degree, but I'd be useless in a government role. I don't understand political science. I don't really understand economics, geopolitics, or anything like that. So the point he makes is that in order to understand how all these things hang together is you need a combination of different disciplines. The other point he makes is that all of these areas have different stresses. And what these stresses do is they cause each of these areas to react. So, for example, public opinion matters a lot to what governments do, especially in an election year, which most of you are going through. And I'm just going to have to just cope with the outcome because I've got no say in it. And if you're a worker, like for a lot of us, the fast pace of technological change. And while these things move, I guess, measure them in years, but all of a sudden when cloud arrives or when the internet arrives, it fundamentally changed our roles. And I'm old enough to remember both of those things pretty well. In other words, grab whoever you work with or whoever you represent and put it right there because that's you. You are all working in very complex socio-technical systems. It doesn't matter if you work in a company of 100, you could be in a company of 1,000, you could be working like I do at LinkedIn with over 20,000 people. It all applies. So that's enough of the background. Let's actually work about the model. So you've got these three boundaries. I'm going to explain each of these boundaries in detail, but I'm going to relate it in the context of a tech company. I'm not going to relate it in the context of another industry or where this paper was built. I've used LinkedIn because I work there. Just a little disclaimer, this doesn't represent LinkedIn at any all, so hopefully no one gets upset with me. But you could put any logo there, it's really going to be the same thing. And in this paper, each of these boundaries, they enact forces. They push away. They don't want, the boundary to cross. And as they push, they start moving away from this point of equilibrium, which you'll never stay. It's static. And as these boundaries move, they start doing these countering forces and they want to try and push it away. So your organization is never going to stay completely in this model. It's going to move around randomly. And yes, that is moving around randomly, by the way. I did not plan that. Okay, so let's look at the economic boundary. Economic boundary, it's the strongest boundary in relation to what we do. It's highly predictable under pressure, and it's very, very easy to see because it's literally your company's bottom line. It's your company's amount of money that it makes versus how much it costs for it to run its business. And it has a huge amount of top-down power. Your C-suites, the leaders of your organization, most of them are in a role to protect your company from ever crossing that line. And so in order to do that, they are empowered to be pretty ruthless in how they are going to protect it from happening. They deal with a lot of external forces. And external forces are trying to pull an organization over these boundaries as well. For an economic barrier, this can be banks. So interest rates go up, rates of inflation change. A company may want to go and get another favorable loan to either pay off some debts or acquire another company or seek investments and things like that. These things impact how much you can do this. You have competitors. Competitors will try and eat into your profit margins. They'll either try and dilute your products. If you've got a great product, everyone is going to be coming for you in some way, shape or form. They're going to try and find ways in which they can eat into your market share. And the other is governments. Governments love tax laws. They love regulations. They will change things. They can greatly impact, in some cases, an entire business. In some cases, an entire industry could be wiped out if a government changes a certain regulation as well. So these are things to deal with. And of course, lastly, the stock market, consumer sentiment, all these things also impacts it. So there's a lot of things that even though they may seem completely isolated to an organization, they do have an effect to varying degrees. And what this manifests in very simple terms is the cost of doing business is starting to outrun how much money a business makes. You could call this, a lot of organizations they look at a lot of different things, but a lot of times people at the top may just look at the EBITDA statement, the earnings before income tax, depreciation, amortization. They'll just look at that and what does that number really tell us? And if it's not going good, our happy shareholders, they start getting very upset. They compel the board to act. And some of these functions can be, in order to protect itself, will be one, they could take a chainsaw to your budget, start cutting that down. Your fancy chefs who work in some of the cafeterias where you work could be replaced with a fruit bowl. I'm going to be a little bit facetious with some of my images here, so bear with me. And this infrastructure that you've created this great plan for because we're going to refit our data centers and we're going to put SSDs in absolutely everywhere. Nope. You will get the same haunted crap that you've always dealt with and be told to patch it for another year or so. In the obviously in the most extreme example is reduction in force or layoffs, which my company's been through it. I'm sure almost all of us have been exposed to this in the last 12 to 18 months. These are very dramatic actions. They have often long-lasting consequences, but they are almost certainly done to protect a company from crossing that line. And unfortunately, for those of us who work on the front lines in SRE roles, well, we don't have that kind of power. We've just got to cope with the outcome. What this leads to is, and this has been mentioned actually, I think Will mentioned it as well in a previous talk, is around the brain drain. It's around if we start losing people in these roles, well then all of a sudden we don't have the kinds of resources that we used to have to fix certain problems. Very large Sev0 incidents, this can be a real problem. And it will force us to create new connections and adaptations. We might either need to relearn things, we might need to reorganize, we might need to restructure, we might need to pull more people on an on-call rotation, all different kinds of actions. And usually what suffers is system performance. It will stagnate or it will regress unless we do a complete wholesale restructure and change everything. On the workload boundary, usually this leads to the inevitable burnout and toxicity. Generally, people start thinking more about themselves. So organisational silos and politics tend to rise because all of a sudden, especially in case of dealing with layoffs, we start being more concerned about ourselves, less concerned about the overall mission. Are we going to make it to the next round of layoffs or are we not? And of course, lastly, people just go, you know what, screw it, I've had enough and I leave. So these are just the ways in which these more dramatic effects on an economic barrier will manifest on others. So let's take a look now at the workload boundary. So for us, this is all about human performance, delivery velocity. This is about how do we do all the things that we do. For someone like myself who is a manager, it's also about work management. What are the processes I can put in place? How do I keep things efficient? How do I ensure I prioritise the right things? How do I try and carve out time for opportunities for people to proactively do things so we're not always constantly reacting? Because a lot of it is about people's morale and engagement. If people are happy and engaged, they're generally going to be more proactive. They generally want to do more. And if they're upset, they're generally only waiting until the clock strikes 5 o'clock and then they turn off their laptop and go home, or just turn it off because they're already at home. And the last one is also about career progression. Most of us who join organisations are not like, say, our great-grandparents where we assume we're going to be there for 30 years. Maybe some of you are, but the vast majority do not do this. It's like, if I'm going to join this organisation or I'm going to be part of this, what is this going to do for my career? How does this set me up for my next play? How does this set me up for success, either within the company or externally to it? These are all the considerations and factors that surround this boundary. The forces that act on it externally, these are mostly, for us, it's going to be about regulatory and compliance. So if you've been through GDPR, for example, was one that all of a sudden imposed a lot of changes on the regular work that we did. We had no say in it. We were forced, we all had to do it, obviously, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to operate. But probably the biggest one was COVID. COVID completely changed everything. I don't know about how it was for you, but it completely changed everything for me. In my case, being able to work more from home was definitely advantageous for me in terms of productivity, but more time with family as well. So that had a big impact on my workload and my life. But when you start approaching this line, what often happens is that rather than having a very top-down effect, this is more localised to the individual, but realistically, people will just go on leave. Either that's, I'm tired, I've had enough, I'm going on DTO, I'm going to take some forced medical leave of absence because I've had enough. Or you'll put less effort into things. You don't have time to do everything properly. You don't have time to think. You don't have time to plan more. So you'll do the barest minimum and move on to the next item in the queue. Or lastly, you may just stop caring. And this goes back to people's engagement as well, which can be, especially in the case of, say, someone like in a management role, this is really serious stuff, because if people basically hate their jobs and don't want to do what they do, that's a big problem for you, because you're not going to get the things done that you hopefully committed to. The other impacts are that on an economic barrier, you're not going to ship the products that you plan to. You're going to cut them down because you no longer have the engagement or the amount of people to do all the things you want to do. And if you do, it's going to take a very long time to do it. Although when times are good, you might be able to hire some more people. That's going to increase the overall operation expense of your organizations. But ultimately too, this is another reaction that can take. If it's so critical, you may then get a headcount increase in your annual budgets. You can hire more people. You can bring them in to do the work. So lastly, on the workload barrier, its impacts are going to be basically a lot of reactiveness on the performance barrier and a lot of deprioritization of things that could proactively prevent your company from crossing that line. Mostly on the economic barrier, it's hiring demands and also revenue implications if you are no longer have the amount of people to build the things that you want to do. So now we get to the fun part that concerns mostly all of us, because I'm assuming most of us here are in operational roles and are not CEOs. And that is the performance boundary. And I have some bad news for you. For all of us, it's the weakest barrier. It is not easy to push back when your organization is drifting ever closer. It's actually really hard. We can't all of a sudden pull a pin on something and say, stop all deployments, stop all product releases, I don't care. You can't really do that. And so your ability to do operations well, your ability to do resiliency, to proactively do things, become this last line of defense. So it's important for especially those who are working in SRE teams or operational roles, is that this is part of what you do. It's fundamental to protecting your teams and to protecting your organization from crossing it. But unfortunately, this boundary becomes really hard to see as your systems get more complex, because when systems start getting more complex, roles and responsibilities tend to decentralize more. I mean, you can try command and control, but honestly, in organizations, and they get so big, it becomes, you literally get drowned in bureaucracy and you'll still cross it anyway. So it's really important that in the local level, these defense in-depth strategies to maintain it become crucial. And I'm going to explain all this, don't worry. The forces that act, that will try and pull us across, look, they are mostly, bad actors. This could be, I don't know, idiots trying to hit your front-end web servers and try and DOS it, or things like that basically give you a bad day, but ultimately hopefully doesn't, or hackers, hopefully not acts of war or acts of God, but or utility companies generally all of a sudden killing power to your data centers. And the other would be, which seems to be the thing at the moment as well, is like generative AI, in that it is changing the nature of the way in which we are going to build out our hardware in the future. It's going to change the way in which we manage all our compute and our infrastructure, especially as companies embrace this across all their suites of products. So the next one is the error margin, which I haven't really mentioned up to now. The error margin it's a virtual boundary for us. It's when we cross it, or we think we cross it, we assume bad things are going to start happening. We assume that this is the point where all of a sudden we're trending into unsafe territory, and we have this sort of margin in which we can gracefully cope with this before things start getting really bad. And it's never static. It drifts. It moves around depending on how much you are paying attention to things, how much you are normalizing things that go wrong or not. And the only way in which we can leverage a lot of these degradations or deviations in this boundary is if really bad things happen. For example, you've had, I don't know, about 10 Sev zeros in the past 2 weeks. It's pretty clear that losing all these teams or not prioritizing these server upgrades is causing major problems. And that's about the only lever you can really pull in cases like this. You need really dramatic things to change often or get more effects from top down and other boundaries. So on this side, things are good. Your systems are healthy, everything is fine. Your infrastructure is getting a lot of love, and hopefully you're all getting sleep and everyone's really happy. And hopefully your metrics are looking pretty good too. But as these forces grow, and in my case, they start pushing LinkedIn close to this barrier, the usual thing that we will do is we'll set off some alerts. We'll assume that, oh great, if these metrics are trending in this direction, that forces us to action. We'll get a page, we will deal with it, and hopefully that's enough to prevent bad things from happening. But if we don't pay attention to that, or these things don't work, we start drifting into this margin, which is where all of a sudden our system starts sweating, little fires start breaking out, and it requires a little more coordinated effort to put the fire out. If you get really close to this line, then we've got really big problems. All of our actions haven't worked. It's possible that this margin was actually a lot thinner than we thought. Our systems start getting really sick. They probably need some injections of serious adrenaline to keep them alive. Major fires break out. Customers start abusing you. You know the story. Huge efforts to put the fire out. And if it crosses, well, this is generally all of our reactions. So yeah, not great. So to summarize, our ability or our collective local knowledge across all of our support teams and our operations team helps to create awareness of this border. It helps us to better tune for this border. This is why it's really important that we focus a lot on the localized way in which we alert on this, and we don't defer it to some top-down committee that arguably is not at the coalface, is not where the work is being done. We all need to prioritise tuning things when things go wrong, obviously, to hopefully be more aware of it and proactively prevent it. But this anticipation of problems, or this ability to proactively prepare or adapt, does require budget and time. And that's something that we've got to be able to plan for. It doesn't work if your team's constantly reactive. And so often it falls onto, especially people in management roles, how do we carve out some time in a sprint or in a quarter to do this? The other thing that's critical, especially for directors, VPs in SRE organisations, you guys need to really be aware of these boundary forces and what the implications are for your teams. If you lack this awareness, you don't lean into this awareness, you are going to miss things. You are not going to prioritise things correctly. You are not going to be able to correctly prioritise the work that needs to be done to keep the company from drifting over this, because this is your responsibility at the end of the day. You have to make sure this doesn't happen. And also be aware that nothing is static, and that any anticipated change is going to cause this margin to drift. So earlier I mentioned normalisation of deviance. This term it was first coined by Diane Vaughan in this excellent book, The Challenger Launch Decision. What it is about is when things go wrong and causes this margin to drift. And it causes the margin to drift because we just literally override problems. We don't look at them, we rationalise things, we do a deployment, we expect these, 100 servers to start flashing red, but if we recycle them, things are fine. That's not a solution. That's just a coping mechanism, and it's reactive and it's not fixing it. Or we miss certain vital signs, ones in which even recently my team was detecting things like core temperatures of CPUs and the correlation of those effects, or detecting flapping Ethernet links or server recycles. Sometimes that's easily missed when you're only more focused on error rates or latency, but these things do have an effect if you drill down, well, at least if you do the analysis. So basically you end up in this sort of this false sense of security. It's where your margin for error is really, really thin. And it means that if, in this case, it means only subtle problems can often cause major problems. So, how do you get it back? You can throw band-aids on your incidents. You can play root cause whack-a-mole games out of your post-mortems and just try and hammer these things down, find the root cause, fix it. That's not going to strengthen this boundary at all. It's literally, it might keep it at bay, or it might just slowly hold it from drifting too far back. What you need to do is look at the effects, as I mentioned earlier, that these other boundaries do. And as leaders of orgs, as you're publishing your incident data, you're not just publishing within your own organisation, but you're socialising this broadly. And you're trying to draw all the contributing factors out that led to these problems surfacing in the first place. And if you do that, your efforts to reinforce this boundary and make it stronger are going to have more collective buy-in, because people are going to be more aware of the impacts of their decisions. A key point Rasmussen makes in his paper in this novel, which is mentioned across even complex systems theory, is that actions in one part of a system have unintended consequences in other parts of the system. You don't see it, you don't know it, but it will happen. So the difference, what we call here, is about between an open and a closed feedback loop. If you are not looking at all these contributing factors, you are not closing the loop. You're just leaving it open, and you're leaving it open for more problems to manifest. So, because I'm bouncing around a lot, you can detect it if you want to. You could do things like, merge, use your current traffic on your website, merge it, fire it at one DC and not another DC. You can do what we call load shifting or load testing. The other way in which you can do this is through synthetic testing. This could be where you would say the Linux traffic control module. You can start adding latency on outgoing packets and start measuring the impacts. You could increase error rates. You could start terminating servers. And the goal of doing this is literally just to find out what was the deviance between what you think is the normal state or where you think the error margin is and where it actually is. In reality, this is the underlying principle of chaos engineering. It's not break shit and watch what happens. It's literally, what is my deviance between what I think is normal and if I dial up pressure, what happens? Does it cause a problem? And if so, if it does, use that information to proactively move this margin out if you need to and reinforce it. So that is literally Rasmussen's model in a tech company context. That's pretty much what it is. LinkedIn's moving around a hell of a lot, and that's scary. So lastly, what does this model teach us? Because it's created an academic research paper. I recognize these papers can be very dense, and sometimes the barrier to entry for a lot of these papers is pretty high because they use a lot of concepts that you also have to educate yourself on. So part of my goal of this talk is to hopefully not require you to do that so much, or at least pique your interest in doing it. But what it will teach us, in fact, any complex systems theory will teach you, is that actions have unintended consequences. The actions that people make in different parts of organizations can affect those of us who are tasked with maintaining this performance barrier. Which is why it's crucial to understand these impacts. I mean, it's pretty obvious that layoffs or reductions in force are going to have an impact if they do affect your SRE organizations, but being able to understand that and then articulate it back enriches your ability to push back on this, to actually explain with authority or explain with conviction, no, because of these actions, this is why this happened. And that's important because then that gives you a greater emphasis or drive to get these things fixed. As managers, those of us in SRE organizations and leadership roles, it's really important to drive clearer detections of error margins. It's not acceptable to simply just throw 100 different monitoring things on things you think and not actually test them. I have lost count of the amount of times I've seen someone get woken up because of HTTP 400 errors hitting your website at 2 o'clock in the morning. If it's not affecting customer performance, don't wake someone up for that. That can wait. Your mileage may vary, but in the majority of cases I've worked with, you just don't need it. And what you will do through those actions is reduce the distractions. You'll actually get better focus on what you're trying to improve and less wasted work, and hopefully you'll sleep better too. The lessons that we can take from this is that root causing problems on the performance boundary is not going to make things better. It's at most just going to keep things at bay or hold it off. Look broader. Look at contributing factors. Stop using vanity or rolled up metrics. I know there's probably been enough written about mean time to recovery and other things. I'm just going to say at the very local team level, as a manager, as someone with SREs, this metric has some interest to me. This metric has some interest to me into how are we responding in time amongst us. But if you are taking that metric and then you're averaging it across all the teams and you're averaging it up and you're averaging it up, it's stupid. It doesn't tell you anything. It's basically washing out problems or it's basically blinding you to other areas. So close your feedback loops and look at all the data. And I mean, it goes without saying, but while these dramatic actions are necessary, if we as leaders in organizations do not lean in on the emotional impacts of these decisions, if we are not actually trying to think about, okay, what is the real impact on morale? If our response to that is, yeah, things will get harder, but don't worry, things will get better, that's not an answer. While these actions may be necessary to protect an organisation, if we don't really think harder then about how this will affect morale and engagement, we actually could be making a problem much worse than we originally planned. Because people's morale and engagement is critical to success. That is definitely one lesson I've learned throughout my entire career. So lastly, here's some references for you as well. Just a few ones that I liked from this. And thank you for your attendance. That's the link to my talk, by the way. If you open up a browser, you'll get the same talk. So all the links are clickable. So thank you.